There is no concept of private bedrooms here. Sleep, like almost every other aspect of life in this era, is a communal affair, a shared experience born not of choice, but of stark necessity. In one corner of the hut, away from the door where the sharpest draughts intrude, lies the family's bed. This designated space bears little resemblance to our modern understanding of the word. It is not a distinct piece of furniture with legs and a frame, but rather a fundamental part of the room's geography, a nest built by human hands against the creeping cold of the earth. In some homes, it might be a low wooden platform, constructed from rough-hewn planks raised just a few inches off the ground. This small elevation creates a vital pocket of air, a buffer, however slight, against the damp and the chilling cold that radiates from the packed dirt floor. But for this family, and for many like them, the bed is even simpler. It is a specific area of the floor itself, carefully chosen and built up in layers, a testament to the ingenuity of survival. The foundation of this sleeping space is a thick, deep layer of straw. This is not the clean, golden straw of a picturesque farm, but a coarse, functional material, the dried stalks of the last grain harvest. It is the very essence of the agricultural year, brought inside to serve a final, crucial purpose. The straw pallet, or palliasse as it was known, could be a foot or more deep, a dense cushion that provides the primary barrier against the unyielding cold of the ground beneath. The earth is a vast heat sink, endlessly drawing warmth away from any living body. His layer of straw, filled with countless tiny pockets of trapped air, is the first and most important line of defense. The straw was gathered in the autumn, and it will serve the family through the entire winter. It is not changed often. The labor is too great, and the material too precious. Perhaps once a year, in the spring, the old, compressed, and soiled straw will be mucked out, destined for the compost heap, or to be mixed into the daub for repairing the walls. Until then, it is the family's foundation. With every movement, it emits a dry, rustling sound, a constant, whispering chorus to the quiet of the night. It carries the faint, earthy scent of dried fields, a smell that mingles with the ever-present aroma of wood smoke and damp wool. On top of this deep layer of loose straw lies the mattress. This is not a mattress in our sense, but a large sack, a tick, fashioned from a sturdy, rough fabric. The material is likely hardened cloth, a coarse textile woven from hemp or the tougher fibers of the flax plant. It is scratchy and unforgiving to the touch, designed for durability, not for comfort. This large sack, perhaps sewn by the mother of the family during the longer days of summer, is filled to bursting with more straw. The quality of the straw in the tick might be slightly better, perhaps softer or cleaner than the loose straw of the palliasse beneath, but it is still fundamentally the same material. Over weeks and months of use, this straw-filled sack becomes compressed and hard under the weight of the sleeping bodies. It develops lumps and hollows, a topography of its own that must be negotiated each night. The family members would know its landscape intimately, the familiar hollow for a hip, the lumpy ridge that supports a shoulder. Each morning, the tick might be shaken and fluffed, an attempt to redistribute the filling and restore some loft, but the relentless compression always wins. For a slightly more prosperous peasant family, a yeoman farmer with a bit more land, the filling of this mattress tick might be a step above straw. They might use dried moss, carefully gathered from the woods, which offered a bit more springiness, or perhaps dried leaves, bracken, or heather, each lending its own unique texture and faint scent to the bed. A truly fortunate family might have a mattress filled with flock. Flock was made of small tufts of wool, or even rags and fabric scraps that had been shredded and combed. A flock-filled mattress was a significant step up in comfort. It was softer, warmer, and held its shape better than straw. But wool was a valuable commodity. A peasant family's flock of sheep, if they had one, was a source of precious wool for clothing. To use it as bedding was a luxury that many could not afford. For the family in our hut, the rustle and prickle of straw is the nightly reality. This bed of straw, however, is not inhabited by the family alone. It is a thriving ecosystem, a microcosm of life that is an inescapable part of the medieval world. The straw, the woolen blankets, the unwashed bodies, and the general lack of sanitation create a perfect environment for a host of tiny, unseen bedfellows. Fleas are a constant presence. They live and breed in the straw and the bedding, their bites leaving small, itchy welts on the skin. Lice, too, are an accepted part of life. They live in the seams of clothing and in the hair, and the close quarters of the communal bed allow them to move easily from one person to another. The concept of personal space is non-existent, and so is the concept of pest control. People would try to manage the infestations. In the summer, bedding might be taken outside, shaken vigorously, and left in the hot sun, a process that could kill some of the insects and their eggs. Certain herbs, like pennyroyal or tansy, might be strewn amongst the straw, as their pungent smells were believed to repel fleas. But these remedies were of limited effectiveness. The constant low-level irritation of itching was a sensory input as common as the feeling of cold or the smell of smoke. It was a discomfort to be endured, a part of the fabric of existence. At night, in the darkness, the sensation of a tiny creature crawling on your skin was a familiar, if unwelcome, event. Over the straw-filled tick, the next layer might be a sheet. If the family owns one, it would be, like the mattress tick, made of a coarse linen or hemp fabric. It would not be soft or smooth. Its purpose was not primarily comfort, but hygiene, such as it was. The sheet served as a barrier, protecting the more valuable woolen blankets from the sweat and grime of the bodies. Washing a sheet, while still a difficult chore, was far easier than washing a heavy wool blanket. The washing would be done in a nearby stream or river, even in the cold of winter, a brutal task involving beating the fabric against rocks and using a harsh soap made from animal fat and ash. Because of this difficulty, the sheet would not be washed frequently. It would be used for many nights, absorbing the odors of sleep and smoke until it was deemed absolutely necessary to clean it. The most important layers, the true shields against the night's cold, are the coverings. The family might have one or two precious blankets, and these would be made of wool. Wool was a miracle fabric in the pre-industrial world. Its unique, crimped fibers trap air, creating a powerful insulating layer. Crucially, wool can absorb a significant amount of moisture without feeling wet, and it retains its insulating properties even when damp. In the humid, cold environment of the hut, this was a life-saving quality. These blankets are heavy, substantial objects. They are not soft and fluffy, but dense and somewhat oily to the touch, still containing some of the natural lanolin from the sheep. This lanolin adds to the wool's water resistance and gives it a distinct, animal smell. A family's blanket was a prized possession, an investment that could mean the difference between life and death in a harsh winter. It would be passed down through generations, becoming softer and thinner with age. It would be a patchwork of repairs, with holes darned and tears mended over and over again. A visible history of the family's struggle for warmth. For extra weight and an almost impermeable barrier against drafts, a cured animal hide might be added on top of the woolen blankets. This could be a deerskin from a successful hunt, or more likely, a sheepskin or a goatskin from one of the family's own animals. The process of tanning the hide would have been done at home, using brains or tannin from tree bark, resulting in a stiff but durable material. The fur or hair would often be left on for maximum warmth. This hide would be heavy, and its weight would be a comfort, pressing the other blankets down and sealing the sleepers in a cocoon of their own body heat. It would smell strongly of leather and the animal it came from, another layer in the rich sensory tapestry of the bed. Now, with the bed prepared, the family begins to settle for the night. The modern idea of sleeping alone is a foreign concept, a strange and perhaps even frightening luxury, reserved for the very wealthy or the spiritually secluded, like hermits or anchorites. For this family, huddling together is the ultimate survival strategy. Sleep is not a private retreat, but a communal act of preservation. The entire household shares this one sleeping space. The father and mother, as the heads of the household and the core of the family, will typically sleep in the center. Here, they are best protected from drafts, and their combined body heat forms a central furnace for the entire group. The children are arranged around them, a constellation of small bodies. The youngest child, perhaps an infant, would sleep nestled between the parents or right beside the mother. This provided the infant with essential warmth and easy access for nighttime feeding. However, this practice carried a grim risk. Church records and coroners' rolls from the period frequently mention the danger of overlaying the accidental suffocation of an infant by a sleeping parent. It was a recognized tragedy of medieval life, a terrible consequence of the need for shared warmth. The older children would find their places on either side of their parents, arranged by age, or simply by who got into the bed first. Grandparents, if they lived with the family, would also join the pile. Their placement might depend on their physical condition. A frail elder would be given a position closer to the warm center. Should a traveler or a guest be staying the night, the rules of hospitality would demand they be offered a place in the bed. This was a common practice, and a guest would be given a spot on the outer edge. This was the position of least warmth and most exposure to drafts, a subtle but clear demarcation between family and outsider. This is not about intimacy or affection in the modern sense. It is about simple, brutal thermodynamics. A single sleeping person loses heat from all sides of their body. But when people are pressed together, the surfaces of their bodies that are in contact are not losing heat to the cold air. Instead, they are sharing heat. The collective body heat generated by 5, 6, or even more people in a single bed creates a pocket of significantly warmer air, a microclimate trapped beneath the heavy layers of wool and hide. This shared warmth is a furnace fueled by human life, and it is what makes restorative sleep possible when the temperature in the hut hovers near freezing. The physical sensation of this arrangement is all-encompassing. There is the constant pressure and weight of other bodies, an arm thrown across your chest, a leg tangled with yours, the back of a sibling's head pressed against your face. You can feel the subtle movements of others as they shift in their sleep. You can hear every breath, every soft snore, every sleepy mumble, every cough. The air under the blankets becomes thick and warm, heavy with the smell of sleep and unwashed humanity. It is an existence without privacy, where the boundary between one individual and another becomes blurred in the nightly huddle. This is the reality of the medieval bed. It is not a place of solitary repose, but a shared vessel, a human raft, where a family clusters together to ride out the long, cold, and dangerous tide of the winter night. As the last of the family settles in, pulling the heavy coverings up to their chins, a quiet descends, broken only by the sound of the wind and the soft rustle of straw. They are about to descend into the first sleep, a journey into unconsciousness that is both a respite and a continuation of their collective struggle for survival. We hope this deep dive into their world helps you find your own rest. If you are enjoying this journey into the quiet details of the past, please consider subscribing for more stories designed for relaxation and sleep. For now, let the sounds of our world fade, and let the quiet of theirs embrace you as the family settles into their communal bed, a dense cluster of humanity burrowing into the rustling straw. Another modern assumption must be completely set aside: the very idea of changing into special clothing for the night. The concept of pajamas, nightgowns, or any garment designated solely for sleep is a luxury that lies centuries in the future. In this world, clothing is a scarce and precious resource, a significant investment of labor and materials. A peasant family would own a very small number of garments, and each piece would be worn until it was little more than a collection of threads and patches. Therefore, the layers they wore to protect themselves from the chill of the day were the very same layers they relied upon to survive the deep, freezing cold of the night. There was no ritual of undressing, no shedding of the day's attire. Instead, the transition to sleep was a process of addition, of gathering and wrapping, of transforming one's daily costume into a personal sleeping cocoon. The garment worn closest to the skin, the foundational layer for every man, woman, and child, was a simple, long shirt or tunic. For a woman, this was her chemise or smock. For a man, his tunic. This garment was the medieval equivalent of underwear, but it was far more substantial. It was typically made from linen or hemp, plant-based fabrics that were durable and absorbent. The process of creating this cloth was arduous and lengthy. It began with the cultivation of flax or hemp plants, which were then harvested, a process of rotting the woody core of the stalk, scutched, beaten to separate the fibers, and heckled, combed to clean and align them. Only then could the fibers be spun into thread, a task that occupied countless hours for the women of the household, using a simple drop spindle or a spinning wheel. Finally, the thread was woven into cloth on a hand loom. The resulting fabric was not soft or smooth, especially when new. It was a coarse, scratchy material, a constant, abrasive presence against the skin. Its color would be a natural, undyed shade of gray or beige. The primary purpose of this linen undergarment was not comfort, but a rudimentary form of hygiene and preservation. It served as a crucial barrier between the body and the more valuable outer garments. The linen absorbed the sweat, oils, and grime of the body, preventing them from soiling the woolen clothes worn over it. Washing a heavy wool tunic was an incredibly difficult and risky process. that could cause the garment to shrink and lose its shape. Washing the linen undertunic, while still a laborious chore done in cold water with harsh lye soap, was far more manageable. This undergarment would be worn for many days and many nights before it was washed. It would become softened with wear, but it would also carry the indelible scent of the body. It was a second skin, rarely removed. So, as the family lies down to sleep, each member is encased in this same linen tunic they have worn all day, a garment that holds the memory of their labor and the lingering warmth of their own body. Over this foundational layer came the most important garment for warmth, the woolen tunic, or for a woman, a kirtle or gown. Wool was the cornerstone of clothing in medieval Europe, a truly miraculous material prized for its life-sustaining properties. Its value cannot be overstated. The crimped complex structure of the wool fiber is a natural wonder, creating thousands of tiny air pockets within the fabric. These pockets trap air, which is then warmed by the body, forming an incredibly effective layer of insulation. Furthermore, wool has the remarkable ability to absorb a large amount of moisture, up to a third of its own weight, without feeling wet to the touch. This was vital in the damp, drafty conditions of the hut. Even if the air was humid, or if a person was sweating, the wool would wick that moisture away from the skin, preventing the dangerous chilling effect of dampness. And unlike linen or cotton, wool retains its insulating properties even when it is wet. This made it the ultimate survival fabric. The family's woolen garments would be heavy, dense, and coarse. The wool would have been shorn from their own sheep, if they were fortunate enough to own any, or bartered for at a market. It would have been cleaned of the worst of its dirt and grease, but would still retain a significant amount of lanolin, the natural oil produced by sheep. This lanolin gave the wool a slightly greasy feel and a distinct animal smell that would become more pronounced when the garment was damp. This smell was simply a part of the medieval sensory world, the scent of warmth and protection. The wool would have been hand-spun into thick, strong yarn and then woven into a sturdy cloth. The colors would be muted, derived from natural dyes made from plants like woad for blue, madder for red, or weld for yellow, though many peasant garments were simply the undyed color of the sheep's fleece, a palette of cream, brown, gray, and black. These tunics would be worn day and night, indoors and out. They were functional, durable, and designed to last for years. They would be patched, mended, and repaired until they could hold together no longer. When a garment was finally beyond repair, it would be cut down and repurposed, perhaps into a smaller tunic for a child, or torn into rags, or even shredded to become the filling for a flock mattress. Nothing was wasted. As the family prepares for sleep, they do not remove these essential woolen layers. To do so would be to discard their primary shield against the cold. The itchy, heavy, and fragrant wool is as much a part of their bed as the straw mattress or the blankets covering them. In the absolute depths of winter, when the wind howls like a hungry wolf and the frost paints thick patterns on the inside of the wooden shutters, even more layers would be added before burrowing under the covers. A man might keep on his bries, which were loose linen trousers, and his hosen, which were separate woolen leggings tied to a belt. A woman would simply sleep in her long kirtle. Over their tunics they might wrap a cloak or mantle. A peasant's cloak was often the simplest of garments, a large rectangle of thick fulled wool, sometimes with a hood attached. During the day, it was an outer coat against wind and rain. At night, it became an extra blanket, draped and tucked around the body to eliminate drafts and add another crucial layer of insulation. Any additional scraps of cloth, a scarf, a shawl, would also be pressed into service. The goal was to create a multi-layered defense, a personal fortress of fabric to hoard every bit of precious body heat. One of the most common and vital items of sleeping attire was a head covering. The belief that a great deal of body heat is lost through an uncovered head was a piece of practical folk wisdom, deeply understood. Both men and women, and often children as well, would wear some form of cap to bed. This might be a simple coif of linen or wool, tied under the chin, or just a piece of cloth wrapped securely around the head. A nightcap served several purposes. Its primary function was, of course, to conserve warmth, but it also kept one's hair out of their face and, to some degree, protected the hair from the general grime of the bedding. Perhaps most importantly, it offered a small line of defense against the less pleasant aspects of the hut's environment. The thatched roof above was not a solid, sealed surface. It was home to insects, spiders, and mice. It was not uncommon for dust, dirt, or small creatures to dislodge and fall during the night. A cap offered a measure of protection from whatever might be dropping from the ceiling in the darkness. So, the image of the family settling down is one of fully clothed figures, their heads wrapped or capped, looking more like travelers resting on a journey than people undressed for bed. This brings us to the fundamental rhythm of the night itself, a pattern of sleep that is as alien to our modern experience as the clothes they wore. They would not, and did not, expect to sleep in one long, uninterrupted block until morning. The modern ideal of a solid 8-hour sleep is a relatively recent invention, a product of the Industrial Revolution and the advent of artificial lighting. For most of human history, a different pattern was the norm, a pattern known as biphasic, or segmented sleep. The family would begin their preparations for bed shortly after the sun went down. With no effective or affordable artificial light, the darkness dictated the schedule. A tallow candle, made from animal fat, was smoky, smelly, and gave off poor light. It was used sparingly. The fire provided some light, but it was not enough to work by for long. As darkness fell, the world outside the hut became a place of mystery and danger, and the world inside shrank to the small, flickering circle of the hearth. The evening meal would be eaten. The few chores that could be done in the dim light would be completed, and then there was little else to do but seek rest. They would go to bed early by our standards, perhaps around 8 or 9 o'clock. As the fire was banked for the night, they would fall into what was known as the first sleep, or in Latin, primus somnus. After a long day of hard physical labor, this sleep was likely deep and heavy, a profound state of unconsciousness. The body, exhausted from its toil, would sink into a much-needed period of recovery. For a few hours, the family would lie still in their communal heap, a mass of breathing bodies, their minds quiet. Then, sometime after midnight, a natural and expected transition would occur. One by one, or perhaps in gentle succession, the members of the family would begin to stir. They would drift up from the depths of their first sleep, not with a jolt or a sense of alarm, but into a calm, tranquil state of wakefulness. This period, which could last for an hour or more, was known as the watch, or in French, the dorveil, a combination of the words for sleep and wake. This was not considered a form of insomnia or a sleep disorder. On the contrary, it was a normal, useful, and even cherished part of the night. Medical texts, diaries, court records, and literature from the period all refer to this first and second sleep as a common and accepted fact of life. This waking period was a time of profound quiet and unique intimacy. The world was at its most still. The wind might be the only sound from outside. Inside, the fire would be just a bed of glowing embers, casting a faint warm light that barely pushed back the shadows. The air would be cold and thick with the smell of smoke and sleep. In this liminal state between sleeps, people would engage in a variety of quiet activities. One of the first and most practical tasks would be to attend to the fire. Someone, likely the father or mother, would rise from the bed, the movement sending a rustle through the straw. They would crouch by the hearth, the cold of the earthen floor a shock to their bare feet. Using a stick, they would gently poke at the embers, uncovering the hottest core. They would add a few small, dry pieces of wood or a block of peat, carefully nurturing the glow back towards a small flame, ensuring the source of warmth would not die completely before morning. Another common necessity was to use the chamber pot, a simple ceramic or wooden vessel kept in a corner of the room, to avoid a cold and dangerous trip outside into the pitch-black night. But the watch was more than just a time for practical chores. It was a time for human connection and quiet contemplation. For a husband and wife, this interlude offered a rare moment of privacy. While surrounded by their sleeping children, the darkness and the quiet created a space for hushed conversation. It was a time to talk about the worries of the household, the state of their stored food, a sick animal, a dispute with a neighbor. It was a time to share hopes, to plan, or to simply be together in a way that the busy, communal nature of the day did not allow. Historical and medical texts also suggest that this waking period was a preferred time for marital intimacy, believed to be more fruitful and enjoyable than when one was exhausted at the beginning of the night. It was also a profoundly spiritual time. The quiet and the darkness were seen as conducive to prayer and religious reflection. In a world where faith was woven into the very fabric of daily life, this midnight hour was an opportunity to feel closer to God. People would lie in their beds and quietly recite prayers, reflect on their sins, or contemplate the mysteries of the divine. Dreams from the first sleep were considered significant, potential messages or omens, and this waking period was a time to analyze and interpret them. After an hour or so of this quiet wakefulness, the natural urge to sleep would return. The family members would settle back down into their positions, pulling the heavy blankets tight once more. They would drift off into their second sleep, or secunda somnis. This sleep was often described as being lighter and more filled with dreams than the first. It would last until the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shutters, signaling the start of a new day. This entire pattern, dictated by the natural cycle of light and dark, was the norm for millennia. It only began to disappear in the late 17th and 18th centuries, first among the urban upper classes, and then spreading to the rest of society. The proliferation of street lighting and, later, affordable and effective home lighting from gas and electricity pushed bedtimes later and later. The Industrial Revolution, with its emphasis on factory schedules and a consolidated workday, demanded a consolidated block of sleep. The quiet, reflective interlude of the watch came to be seen as inefficient, a waste of time. By the 20th century, the memory of Befosic sleep had faded so completely that a person waking in the middle of the night began to see it as a problem, a form of insomnia to be cured, rather than a natural human rhythm. As we journey through this night with our medieval family, we are rediscovering a lost world of sleep, a world without pajamas and a night divided in two. It is a world where clothing is a fortress and the darkness is not an enemy to be vanquished by light, but a space to be inhabited in its own unique way. We hope this exploration into the rhythms of the past brings you a sense of tranquility and peace. If you are finding this journey restful and intriguing, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the quiet corners of history. Now, let the knowledge of this natural, segmented sleep ease your mind. Allow yourself to drift, knowing that the night has many rhythms, and all of them can lead to rest. The rhythmic breathing, the occasional soft snore, the rustle of straw from a shifting body, these are the sounds of humanity at rest. But the hut is not silent. It is not occupied solely by this family. Other heartbeats, other breaths, other living bodies share this small sanctuary against the brutal winter night. Their presence is a fundamental aspect of this world, a source of both profound comfort and undeniable filth. To our modern sensibilities, the idea of sharing a single room with farm animals seems unsanitary, unpleasant, a sign of extreme poverty. But to the medieval peasant, this arrangement was a masterful and deeply logical strategy for survival. It was a partnership of warmth, a symbiotic huddling against a common enemy, the killing cold. Just a few feet from the sleeping pallet, in the space between the bed and the far wall, a great, slow-breathing mountain of life makes its presence known. It is the family's cow. She is their single most valuable possession, a walking treasure chest of sustenance and future prosperity. Her worth far exceeds that of the hut itself. She represents milk, which can be turned into butter and cheese, providing essential fats and proteins through the lean winter months. She represents the promise of a calf in the spring, a continuation of the family's wealth. In time, she will represent meat for the table and a hide that can be turned into leather for shoes, belts, or an extra covering for the bed. To leave such a creature outside in a makeshift lean-to or shed during the depths of a brutal winter would be an act of profound foolishness. She would be vulnerable to the freezing temperatures which could sicken or kill her. She would be vulnerable to predators, for a hungry wolf pack, emboldened by scarcity, would see her as a potential meal. Bringing her inside is not a matter of sentimentality. It is a matter of protecting a life-sustaining asset. The decision to bring her indoors, however, yields a second, equally vital benefit, one that is immediately apparent to anyone inside the hut. The cow is a living furnace. A large animal like a cow generates an immense amount of body heat through its own metabolic processes. This is not a small, flickering warmth like a candle, nor is it a heat that needs to be constantly fed and tended like the fire. It is a steady, constant, and powerful radiation of thermal energy. As she stands there, tethered to a post, the heat pours from her massive body, warming the air around her. In the small, enclosed space of the hut, this effect is dramatic. The ambient temperature in her vicinity is noticeably higher than in the rest of the room. The cold that seeps through the door walls is pushed back by the sheer force of her biological warmth. She is a slow-burning, self-regulating stove, and the fuel she consumes is the hay and fodder she was given before the family went to sleep. The sensory evidence of her presence is inescapable. There is the sound of her, a soft rhythmic chewing as she ruminates, bringing up and rechewing her cud. It is a wet, grinding sound, a deeply peaceful and organic noise that becomes part of the nightly soundscape. Occasionally, she will shift her great weight, her hooves making a soft, dull thud on the packed earth floor. She might exhale a long, warm, steamy breath, a sigh that mists in the cold air and carries the sweet, grassy scent of her digestion. And then there is the smell. It is a powerful and complex aroma, a rich, earthy blend of warm animal, hay, and the sharp, ammoniac temps of urine and manure. A designated patch of floor near her is covered with straw to absorb the waste, but the smell is pervasive. It impregnates the smoky air, clings to the woolen blankets, and becomes a permanent part of the hut's atmosphere. To us, it would be an overwhelming stench. To the family, it is the smell of life, the perfume of their most precious asset, a sign that their source of nourishment is safe and warm beside them. It is the smell of survival. The cow may not be the only large animal sharing the space. Near the hearth, in its own designated pile of straw, another creature might be nestled. It is the family pig, another vital source of food. The pig is a marvel of efficiency, capable of turning scraps and foraging into valuable fat and meat. Like the cow, the pig is too valuable to be left to the mercy of the winter. Its presence adds another layer of warmth and another collection of sounds and smells to the room. The pig's breathing is a series of soft, wet snuffles and grunts. When it dreams, it might twitch and squeal softly. Its warmth is concentrated and low to the ground, its sleeping body a small hairy radiator. Its smell is different from the cow's, sharper and more pungent. Smaller animals also find refuge within the hut. A few goats or sheep, prized for their milk and wool, might be tethered along another wall, their musky scent adding to the chorus of farmyard smells. Their nervous, shuffling movements and occasional soft bleats punctuate the night. High above the sleeping family, roosting on the rough-hewn beams that support the thatched roof, are the chickens. During the day, they scratch and peck in the yard, but at night, they are brought inside, safe from foxes and the freezing cold. Their presence is subtle, a soft cluck, the rustle of feathers, the gentle creak of the beam as they shift their weight. Their contribution to the room's warmth is minimal, but their protection is paramount. Their eggs are a crucial source of protein. Of course, their roosting overhead comes with its own particular hazard. The floor beneath them, and anything else, is subject to the random fall of their droppings. It is a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of survival, another small discomfort to be endured. This cohabitation is a delicate balance. While the animals provide life-sustaining warmth, they also bring dirt, disease, and their own ecosystem of pests into the living space. The floor is a constant battleground of mud and manure. The air, thick as it is, carries not just smells but also particles that, over a lifetime, would contribute to chronic respiratory ailments. The close proximity to animals also increases the risk of zoonotic diseases, infections that can pass from animals to humans. These dangers were real, but they were secondary to the immediate and ever-present threat of freezing to death or losing one's entire livelihood to the cold. The calculus of survival was stark and simple. The warmth and security provided by the animals far outweighed the risks and discomforts of their presence. The sounds of their breathing and chewing were not a disturbance. They were a lullaby of reassurance. Each grunt, each soft moo, each rustle was an affirmation that the family's wealth, their food source, their future, was alive and well, sharing the same small pocket of relative warmth in a vast and frozen world. But the living warmth of human and animal bodies was not the only strategy deployed against the cold. The family also practiced a form of thermal energy storage, a simple but ingenious method of capturing the heat of the fire and using it long after the flames had died down. Earlier in the evening, while the fire in the central hearth was still burning brightly from cooking the evening meal, several smooth, dense stones would have been carefully placed in the heart of the glowing embers. These would not be just any stones picked up from the yard. They would be river stones, worn smooth by water, chosen for their density and their lack of cracks or fissures. A porous or cracked stone, when heated, could trap moisture that would turn to steam and cause the stone to explode, sending dangerous shards of hot rock across the room. The knowledge of which stones to use was a piece of practical wisdom passed down through generations. For hours, these stones sat in the fire, absorbing the intense heat, their very molecules vibrating with stored energy. They would glow a dull, menacing red in the heart of the embers. Now, in the period of wakefulness between the first and second sleep, or perhaps just before settling down for the first sleep, this stored energy is harvested. The mother of the family might rise from the bed, her movements slow and deliberate in the near darkness. She approaches the hearth, where the embers still give off a soft light and a gentle warmth. Using a sturdy stick or a pair of simple iron tongs, she carefully pulls one of the stones from the embers. The stone is intensely hot, radiating a fierce, shimmering heat that makes the air around it waver. It cannot be touched. Her next step is crucial. She takes a collection of rags, pieces of old worn-out linen or wool that are too tattered for any other purpose. She wraps the stone in layer after layer of this cloth. The first layer might hiss and scorch slightly as it makes contact with the stone's superheated surface. She must wrap it thickly enough to prevent anyone from being burned, but not so thickly that it completely smothers the heat. It is a delicate balance, learned through years of practice. The wrapped stone is now a portable, personal heating device, a primitive hot water bottle. She carries this precious bundle of warmth back to the communal bed. Carefully, she lifts the edge of the heavy woolen blankets and shoves the wrapped stone deep into the foot of the bed, down into the prickly landscape of the straw mattress. There, nestled amongst the cold feet of her family, the stone begins its work. It slowly, steadily releases its stored heat. The warmth radiates outwards, first through the layers of cloth, then into the surrounding straw and blankets, and finally into the chilled limbs of the sleepers. The sensation is one of profound and spreading comfort. The gnawing ache of cold feet begins to subside, replaced by a deep, penetrating warmth. This small, focused source of heat is a luxury, a focal point of comfort in the general cold of the bed. The stone will continue to release its heat for hours, its temperature gradually declining. It is a slow-release furnace, a small sun buried in their straw world, and its gentle warmth helps to lull them back into the deep, restorative peace of their second sleep. A single stone might be used, or several, depending on the severity of the cold and the size of the family. In a wealthier household, a manor house, or the home of a prosperous merchant, a more sophisticated version of this technology would be used. This was the bed warmer. It was a metal pan, usually made of copper or brass for its excellent heat conductivity, with a hinged and often perforated lid attached to a long wooden handle. Instead of stones, the pan would be filled with hot coals raked from the fireplace. The lid would be closed, and the device would be gripped by its long handle and passed between the sheets of a cold bed, warming the linen before the person got in. This was an object of some value, a sign of a certain level of comfort and status. For the family in our hut, however, such an object is an unimaginable luxury. Their technology is of the earth, a simple, smooth stone, heated in the fire, a technique as old as humanity's first mastery of flame. It is a testament to their resourcefulness, their ability to find solutions with the materials at hand. And so, the family is cocooned in a complex tapestry of warmth, a multi-layered system both living and inanimate. The foundation is their own collective body heat, the huddling of human forms sharing their vitality. The next layer is the immense, steady radiation from the livestock, the great, slow-breathing animals that share their shelter and their fate. Finally, there is the focused, personal comfort of the heated stone, a small, deliberate act of defiance against the night's chill. Each source of warmth has its own character, its own smells and sounds, its own benefits and drawbacks. Together, they create an environment that is just barely on the right side of survival. It is not comfortable by our standards. It is a world of scratchy wool, prickly straw, pungent smells, and constant low-level irritation. But it is a world that is warm enough. It is a world where sleep is possible, where the body can rest and recover, and where the family can endure one more long, dark, and brutal medieval winter night, secure in their small, smoky, and profoundly alive little ark. This intricate dance of survival, this careful management of heat and life, offers a window into a world so different from our own. We hope this exploration of their nightly preparations brings you a deeper sense of your own comfort and a feeling of profound relaxation. If you are enjoying this journey into the quiet history of the night, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories designed to soothe the mind and encourage restful sleep. For now, let the thought of that simple, spreading warmth from a heated stone. Fill your own senses, and allow yourself to drift into a deep and peaceful rest. Let us now turn our attention away from the sleeping inhabitants, and consider the vessel that contains them. The small, humble hut that is their entire world during these long winter nights. It is easy for the modern mind to dismiss such a structure as a primitive hovel, a flimsy and inadequate shelter against the ferocity of a medieval winter. But to do so is to fundamentally misunderstand its nature. This hut is not a sign of failure, but a testament to success. It is a highly evolved piece of technology, a survival machine crafted with an intimate and profound knowledge of the local environment. Every timber, every handful of mud, every stalk of straw has been carefully chosen and placed with a single, overriding purpose: to keep the killing cold at bay and to preserve the precious, life-sustaining warmth generated within. It is a shell, a nest, a fortress of organic materials, and its design is a masterclass in resilience and ingenuity. The story of the hut's defense begins not with its construction, but with its placement in the landscape. The family who built this home, or their ancestors before them, did not choose this spot at random. They read the land with a skill that we have almost entirely lost. They would have sought a location that offered natural advantages in the war against winter. The hut does not stand on the exposed crest of a hill, where it would be battered by the full, unbroken force of the wind, nor is it situated at the very bottom of a valley, where the coldest, heaviest air pulls on still, clear nights, a phenomenon we now call temperature inversion. Instead, it is likely nestled on a gentle south-facing slope. This orientation is a deliberate and critical choice. The low winter sun, a pale but precious source of energy, would strike its longest wall and its door for the few hours of daylight that the season offered, providing a small but meaningful amount of solar gain. Furthermore, the hut is likely sheltered by a natural windbreak, perhaps a small stand of hardy, coniferous trees to the north or west, the direction from which the prevailing winter winds would blow. This natural barrier disrupts the flow of the wind, creating a pocket of calmer, slightly less frigid air around the dwelling. In some cases, the builders would have used the very earth itself as a building material. The hut might be a sunken feature dwelling, with its floor dug a foot or two into the ground, allowing the surrounding soil to insulate the lower walls. Or it might be built directly into the side of a hill, with the earth of the bank forming one of its walls, a technique that provides unparalleled insulation and stability. The people who built this understood a fundamental principle of thermodynamics. The earth beneath their feet maintains a far more constant and forgiving temperature than the air. By burrowing into it, they were borrowing the planet's own deep, residual warmth. The foundation of the hut is this very earth. There are no concrete footings, no stone foundations in the manner of a church or a lord's manor. The primary structural elements, the great timber posts that form the skeleton of the building, are sunk deep into the ground, below the frost line where the soil is more stable. The floor of the hut is the earth itself, but it is not simply loose dirt. It has been painstakingly prepared. The ground was likely cleared, leveled, and then pounded until it was hard and compact. Often, a mixture of clay, sand, and water would be spread over the surface and tamped down repeatedly, creating a floor that was firm, relatively smooth, and less prone to turning into mud. In some regions, a final layer of oxblood and ash might have been applied. This gruesome-sounding mixture, when it dried, created a surprisingly hard, durable, and water-resistant surface, sealing the floor and keeping some of the dampness from seeping up from the ground below. Still, the earthen floor would be a constant source of cold. To combat this, and to add a measure of comfort and cleanliness, the floor would be covered with a thick layer of strewn material. In the summer, this might be fresh green rushes harvested from a nearby marsh, which would release a pleasant sweet scent when crushed underfoot. In the winter, the covering is more likely to be straw, the same material used in the bed. This layer of straw acts as a simple but effective insulation, a carpet that traps a layer of air between the cold floor and the feet of the inhabitants. It also absorbs spills, mud, and animal waste. Over the course of the winter, this floor covering would not be entirely replaced. Instead, new layers of straw or rushes would simply be put down on top of the old. This created a thick, compressed mat of organic material. Interspersed within these layers, the woman of the house would scatter dried, aromatic herbs gathered in the autumn, plants like meadowsweet, lavender, or chamomile. These herbs, when trodden upon, would release their fragrance, helping to combat the ever-present smells of smoke, animals, and unwashed humanity. This layered, decomposing flooring, a sort of indoor compost heap, would also generate a small but not insignificant amount of heat through the natural process of decomposition, another small contribution to the hut's overall thermal economy. The skeleton of the hut, the frame that gives it its shape and strength, is made of timber. But this is not the neat, sawn lumber of modern construction. It is a collection of massive rough-hewn logs, shaped by hand with an axe and an adze. The marks of these tools are visible on every surface, a testament to the immense labor required to build the structure. A common form of construction for such a dwelling was the cruck frame, a pair of massive, naturally curved timbers, harvested from a single tree trunk split in two, would be raised to form a great A shape. These two cruck blades would be joined at the peak with a complex joint and a wooden peg, forming a single, stable arch. Several of these cruck frames would be set up in a row, and then joined together by a ridgepole at the peak and horizontal purlins along the sides. This method was incredibly strong and used the natural shapes of the trees to great effect, creating the characteristic high-peaked roof and curved interior walls of many medieval peasant homes. The wood itself would likely be oak, a hardwood renowned for its strength and resistance to rot. The peasant would not have owned the forest. The trees belonged to the lord of the manor. He would have had to secure the right of istova, the traditional right to take wood for building and fuel, to harvest these essential materials. The timbers, once shaped, were joined not with metal nails, which were a rare and expensive commodity, but with carefully carved mortise and tenon joints, drilled and pegged with wooden dowels called trunnels. The entire frame was a complex, interlocking puzzle of wood, held together by friction, gravity, and skilled craftsmanship. In the dead of night, the great timbers of the frame groan and creak under the immense pressure of the wind, the sound like a sleeping giant stirring in the darkness. If the timber frame is the hut's skeleton, its skin is the wattle and daub of the walls. This is the true genius of peasant architecture, a composite material created from the cheapest and most abundant resources: sticks, mud, straw, and dung. The process began with the wattle. A series of upright wooden stakes or staves were driven into the ground or fixed to the timber frame. Then, long, flexible saplings, often hazel or willow, were harvested and woven between these stakes in a simple over and under pattern. The result was a giant, sturdy, and slightly flexible panel of basketwork, filling the spaces between the main timbers of the frame. This woven lattice was the armature for the wall. Next came the daub, the thick plaster that would give the wall its substance and its insulating properties. This was a carefully formulated recipe, a sort of medieval concrete. The primary ingredient was clay or heavy, sticky soil, dug from a pit near the building site. To this was added a binding agent, a temper. This was most commonly straw, hay, or even animal hair. These fibers acted just like rebar in modern concrete, providing tensile strength and preventing the daub from cracking and falling apart as it dried. The final, and perhaps most important, ingredient was animal dung, usually from a cow or a horse. The dung was not added for its scent. It was a source of additional fibrous material that was already partially broken down, making it an excellent binder. Furthermore, the ammonia present in the dung acted as a natural preservative, helping to protect the wooden wattle from rot and deterring some insects. All these ingredients were mixed together with water, usually in a pit, where they were trampled by foot into a thick, homogeneous, and intensely smelly paste. Applying the daub was often a communal activity. Men, women, and children would scoop up great handfuls of the cold, wet mixture and slap it onto both sides of the wattle panel, pushing it hard into the basketwork until the entire wall was a solid, thick mass of mud and straw. The process was messy, cold, and exhausting. Once applied, the daub would take weeks, or even months, to dry completely. As it dried, it would shrink, and small cracks would appear, which would need to be patched with more daub. The final surface was not smooth or flat, but undulating and rough, bearing the marks of the hands that applied it. Once fully cured, the walls were surprisingly durable and, most importantly, they had excellent thermal properties. The thick layer of mud and straw provided a significant amount of insulation, and it also created thermal mass. This means the walls themselves would absorb heat from the central fire during the day and then slowly, gently radiate that heat back into the hut during the long, cold night, helping to stabilize the internal temperature. The roof is the hut's great shaggy hat, its final and most important shield against the elements. It is a thick, heavy blanket of thatch. The material for the thatch would depend on the local environment. In marshy areas, water reed was the preferred material, as it was incredibly dense, durable, and naturally waterproof. In other areas, straw from the grain harvest would be used, or even heather from the moors. The thatching process was a highly skilled craft. Bundles of the material were tied to the horizontal roof timbers, or laths, in overlapping layers, starting at the eaves and working up to the ridge. A thick thatch, perhaps 1.5 feet deep, was an exceptionally effective insulator, far superior to modern slate or tile. The dense, compacted layers of hollow stems trapped a massive amount of air, creating a barrier that was almost impervious to the cold. It was also surprisingly waterproof, as the water would run down the outside of the stalks, unable to penetrate the dense layers. The roof absorbed sound, so the howling of the wind and the drumming of winter rain would be muted into a soft, soporific whisper inside the hut. The thatch was also a living ecosystem, home to mice, birds, and a universe of insects. At the very peak of the roof, there was no chimney as we would know it. Instead, there was simply a hole, perhaps covered by a movable wooden cap or a ceramic vent, to allow the smoke from the central hearth to escape. The openings in this carefully constructed shell were its greatest points of weakness, and they were kept to an absolute minimum. Windows were few, small, and strategically placed. A large opening would be a source of catastrophic heat loss and a structural vulnerability. The small window openings would not be filled with glass. Glass was a fantastically expensive luxury, reserved for churches and the castles of the great nobility. Instead, the opening would be covered by a simple, solid wood shutter, which could be barred at night. These shutters would fit imperfectly, and the wind would find its way through the cracks, creating whistling drafts that were a constant feature of the interior, to let in some light while keeping out the worst of the weather. A window might be covered with a piece of oiled cloth or paper, or a lanthorn, which was a thin, scraped sheet of animal horn. These materials were translucent rather than transparent, allowing a dim, yellowed, and mysterious light to filter into the hut during the day. The door was the single largest opening, and it was a formidable barrier. It would be made of thick, vertical planks of wood, held together by horizontal ledges and perhaps a diagonal brace. It would swing not on metal hinges, but on simple, sturdy leather straps or a wooden pintle system. There was no lock and key. Security was provided by a heavy wooden drawbar, a thick beam that was slid across the entire width of the door on the inside and dropped into heavy wooden or stone brackets. When this bar was thrown, the hut was sealed. It was a powerful and final gesture at the end of the day, a clear demarcation between the small, warm world of the family and the cold, dark, and potentially dangerous world outside. Even this heavy door was not airtight. A cold draft would perpetually snake its way across the floor from the gap at the bottom. A sausage-shaped tube of cloth filled with sand or rags, a primitive draft excluder, might be laid against it to block the worst of the chill. Finally, the winter itself was recruited as a building partner. After a heavy snowfall, the family would not necessarily clear all the snow away from the hut. Instead, they would actively pile it up against the walls, especially the north wall that faced the coldest winds. Like the structure of an igloo, a thick bank of compacted snow is a surprisingly effective insulator. The snow is full of trapped air, and it forms a protective blanket, shielding the daub walls from the wind and raising the temperature of the wall's outer surface. This final act transformed the hut into a hybrid structure, part architecture, part landscape, a snowdrift with a warm, living heart. Every single element, from the dung in the walls to the snow piled against them, was part of a complex and intelligent system designed for a single purpose: to make the hut a habitable space. It was not an airy or bright space. It was a dark, smoky, smelly, and cramped environment. But it was a survivable environment. It was a machine that captured and conserved heat in every possible way. We hope this detailed look at the structure of this medieval home has given you a new appreciation for the knowledge and resilience of the people who lived within it. If you find these quiet explorations of the past to be a source of calm and a path to relaxation, please consider subscribing for more journeys into the sleeping world of our ancestors. For now, feel the security of your own walls. and let the quiet ingenuity of this simple hut inspire a sense of deep and profound peace. Sleep in the medieval hut was not a peaceful sanctuary, a guaranteed respite from the hardships of the day. It was a state of profound vulnerability, a nightly tightrope walk over a chasm of potential dangers. The darkness, which they inhabited so completely, was not empty. It was filled with threats, both tangible and imagined, that made the long hours between dusk and dawn a time of low-grade, persistent anxiety. The very elements that provided life and comfort, the fire that gave warmth, the roof that gave shelter, the darkness that brought rest, could, with a moment's carelessness or a turn of ill fortune, become instruments of disaster. Survival through the night was never a certainty. It was an achievement, a small victory won anew each morning. The most immediate and terrifying of these dangers glowed at the very heart of the hut, the central hearth. This simple pit of fire was the family's anchor, their source of cooked food, their primary defense against the gnawing cold, and the social center of their small world. Its flickering light was a beacon of life in the immense darkness, but it was also a captive monster, a tamed but untrustworthy beast that could slip its leash at any moment and consume them. The risk of fire was an ever-present and visceral fear in a world built almost entirely of flammable materials. The hut itself was a tinderbox. The walls were a matrix of dry sticks and straw. The floor was covered in a thick, dry layer of the same. The bed was a mountain of loose, tinder-dry straw. And overhead, the great, shaggy roof was a massive accumulation of dried reeds or straw, blackened and seasoned by years of rising smoke, just waiting for a spark. The danger began with the management of the fire itself, the practice of banking the fire for the night, covering the embers with a layer of ash to keep them smoldering until morning, was a delicate art. If it was done carelessly, if a pocket of air was allowed to reach the embers too quickly, the fire could flare up unexpectedly in the middle of the night. A log, not properly settled, could shift and roll out of the shallow hearth, spilling a cascade of glowing coals onto the straw-strewn floor. A sudden, powerful gust of wind coming down through the smoke hole in the roof could whip the embers into a frenzy, sending a shower of sparks upwards. The family was acutely aware of this risk. The last person awake would have meticulously tended the fire, their actions guided by a lifetime of experience. But accidents were horrifyingly common. Imagine the scenario. A single, unnoticed spark, no bigger than a firefly, drifts lazily on the smoky air. It doesn't fall back into the hearth. Instead, a convection current carries it towards the corner where the family lies sleeping. It lands on the edge of their woolen blanket. For a moment, it just glows, a tiny point of orange in the darkness. The wool is naturally flame-resistant, and it smolders rather than bursts into flame. But beneath the blanket is the palliasse, the deep bed of straw. The spark falls through a small hole in the blanket and finds a new home in the dry, airy straw. There, it finds the oxygen it needs. A tiny wisp of smoke, almost invisible in the already hazy air, begins to rise. A small orange snake of fire begins to creep through the straw, silently at first. The smell of burning straw is different from the smell of wood smoke, sharper and more acrid. Perhaps this is the first warning, a scent that penetrates the deepest sleep and triggers a primal alarm in the brain. But if no one wakes, the fire grows exponentially. The straw, with its vast surface area and trapped air, ignites with explosive speed. A small flame becomes a roaring inferno in a matter of seconds. The family would be woken not by a gentle warmth, but by a blast of searing heat, a blinding light, and the terrifying roar of the blaze. Panic and disorientation would grip them. The hut, their sanctuary, has become a trap. The air is instantly filled with thick, black, choking smoke, making it impossible to see or breathe. The single, barred door is their only escape route, and finding it in the chaos and the blinding smoke would be a desperate struggle. The thatched roof, once ignited, would burn with incredible ferocity, raining down fire and collapsing inwards. In this horrifying scenario, survival would be measured in seconds. A family could go to sleep in their home and be consumed by it before the nearest neighbor even saw the glow of the flames against the night sky. The charred remains of such huts are a poignant feature in the archaeological record, a silent testament to the frequency of this particular tragedy. Even if a catastrophic fire was avoided, the smoke from the central hearth posed a more insidious, long-term threat. The smoke hole in the roof was a crude and inefficient form of ventilation. It allowed some smoke to escape, but a significant amount would remain, hanging in a thick, permanent cloud in the upper half of the room. The family lived and slept in this haze. The constant inhalation of wood smoke, thick with soot, carbon monoxide, and a host of other toxic compounds would have had a devastating cumulative effect on their health. Their eyes would have been perpetually red and irritated, a condition that could lead to chronic infections and, eventually, impaired vision. Their lungs would have been in a constant state of inflammation. Chronic coughs, bronchitis, and what we would now diagnose as emphysema would have been endemic. The black, carbon-laden mucus they coughed up would have been a normal part of life. This slow, creeping danger was less dramatic than a fire, but it was just as deadly, contributing to shortened lifespans and a high susceptibility to respiratory diseases like pneumonia, which was a common killer in the medieval period. The warmth from the fire was essential for short-term survival, but it came at the cost of long-term health. The cold itself remained a relentless and ever-present enemy. The hut's defenses were formidable, but they were not infallible. During a particularly severe cold snap, when temperatures plummeted far below freezing and a biting wind howled for days on end, the internal temperature of the hut could drop to dangerous levels, especially in the hours just before dawn when the fire was at its lowest. Hypothermia, the dangerous lowering of the body's core temperature, was a very real threat. The most vulnerable were the most susceptible, the very young, whose small bodies lost heat more quickly, the elderly, whose circulatory systems might be weaker, and anyone who was already sick or malnourished, whose body lacked the reserves to fight off the cold. The communal bed was the primary defense against this danger, but it was not a perfect system. A child who thrashed in their sleep and kicked off the heavy blankets could become dangerously chilled. A person sleeping on the outermost edge of the bed, near a drafty wall, was at greater risk than those in the warm center. Waking up in the middle of the night was not just a matter of habit, it was also a survival instinct. It was a chance to check on the other family members, to pull a blanket back over a sleeping child, to make sure everyone was still warm. The line between a deep, restorative sleep and a dangerous, hypothermic stupor could be perilously thin. A person who fell too deeply asleep and became too cold might not wake up at all. The darkness of the medieval night was absolute in a way that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. On a moonless, overcast winter night, the world outside the hut was a void, a realm of total and complete blackness. This darkness was not a neutral canvas. It was populated, in the medieval imagination, by a host of malevolent forces. The night was believed to be the time when the boundaries between the human world and the supernatural world became thin. It was the time of ghosts, demons, and evil spirits. The howling of the wind was not just the movement of air, it could be interpreted as the wail of a lost soul. A strange shadow cast by the dying embers could be seen as a demonic presence. These fears were not abstract superstitions, they were deeply felt realities that shaped the experience of the night. The hut, with its single barred door and the faint glow of the hearth, was a tiny, fragile island of order and safety in a vast, chaotic, and menacing ocean of darkness. The act of barring the door at night was a powerful ritual, a physical and psychological act of sealing the family off from the terrors that lurked outside. But the threats in the darkness were not all supernatural. The winter was a time of hunger, not just for humans, but for the wild animals that shared their landscape. A wolf pack, their usual prey scarce and their hunger sharpened by the cold, would become bolder. They might venture from the deep woods and closer to the human settlement, drawn by the smell of livestock and the faint promise of food. While attacks on humans were rare, they were not unheard of, and the fear they inspired was immense. The sound of a wolf howling in the not so far distance was a chilling and terrifying sound to hear as you lay in your bed. It was a visceral reminder of the untamed wilderness that pressed in on all sides. A reminder that the world outside the thin wattle-and daub walls was a place where humans were not necessarily at the top of the food chain. The family's own livestock, huddled inside the hut with them, were a source of comfort and warmth, but they were also bait. The scent of a cow or a pig would travel for miles on the cold night air, a beacon for any hungry predator. The barred door was not just to keep out evil spirits, it was to keep out very real teeth and claws. Other, smaller dangers also inhabited the night. The thatched roof, as we have seen, was not an inert covering. It was a thriving habitat. Mice and rats, seeking warmth and food, would make their homes in the thatch and in the walls. At night, the family would hear them, the tiny scrabbling of their claws, their high-pitched squeaks. These rodents were not just a nuisance. They were a threat to the family's precious store of grain and a vector for disease. The flea, which infested their bedding, was another deadly vector. While the devastating Black Death was a later medieval catastrophe, other flea-borne diseases were a constant threat. The simple, itchy bite of a flea could be the start of a fatal illness. Even the structure of the hut itself could be a danger. In a severe winter storm, with gale-force winds and heavy wet snow, the structural integrity of the dwelling could be tested to its limits. A poorly maintained roof could leak, sending a demoralizing and dangerous trickle of icy water down onto the sleeping family. The weight of a heavy, sodden snowfall could, in a worst-case scenario, cause a section of the roof to collapse. The great timber frame of the hut, while strong, was subject to the slow decay of rot and the burrowing of wood-boring insects. The possibility of a partial structural failure was a low-level but persistent risk. In this context, sleep was a profound act of trust. It was an act of faith that the fire would stay in its place, that the roof would hold, that the door was strong enough, and that the cold would not deepen to a lethal intensity. It was an act of surrender to a state of defenselessness in a world that was full of things that could do you harm. The Befosic sleep pattern, with its period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, can be seen as an adaptation to this environment of risk. The watch was a literal watch. It was a time to check the fire, to listen for strange sounds outside, to check on the children, to ensure that the small, fragile bubble of safety had not been breached. It was a subconscious patrol, a nightly round of inspection to ensure that the family would live to see the dawn. The night was a siege, and the family, huddled together in their small wooden fortress, had to endure it until the sun, their rescuer, appeared on the horizon. This constant, low-level stress and the ever-present dangers would have had a profound psychological impact, shaping their dreams, their folklore, and their fundamental view of the world. It engendered a sense of fatalism, an acceptance that life was fragile and that disaster could strike at any moment. But it also fostered an incredible resilience, a deep appreciation for the simple fact of waking up in the morning. The first grey light of dawn, filtering through the cracks in the shutters, was not just the start of a new day of labor. It was a symbol of victory, a sign that they had made it through the darkness once again. It was a confirmation that they were, for one more day, survivors. We hope this exploration of the hidden dangers of the medieval night has given you a deeper perspective on the challenges our ancestors faced. As you settle into your own safe and secure surroundings, may this knowledge help to quiet your own mind and lead you to a place of deep and untroubled rest. If you are finding these historical journeys to be a source of calm and fascination, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories from the sleeping world of the past. For now, let go of all worries and sink into the profound peace of a truly safe night. Let us now attempt to step fully into this world, to leave our own time behind and immerse ourselves in the pure, unfiltered sensory experience of a winter night in the medieval hut. To understand the reality of this existence, we must try to perceive the world as its inhabitants did, through a symphony of smells, sounds, textures, and the profound absence of light that shaped their perception of reality. This is a world less seen than it is felt, heard, and smelled, a rich and complex tapestry of sensations that is at once alien and deeply primally human. The night was not an empty void between days, but a distinct state of being, with its own unique atmosphere and character. The first and most dominant sensation, the one that defines the very air they breathe, is the smell. The modern world is largely deodorized. We strive to eliminate or mask odors, to create a neutral olfactory environment. The medieval hut was the polar opposite. It was a place of powerful, complex, and ever-present smells that told the story of the family's life and their struggle for survival. The most pervasive and commanding of all these scents is the smell of wood smoke. This is not the pleasant, fragrant aroma of a modern, well-ventilated fireplace. This is the thick, acrid, and oily smell of an open hearth burning in perfectly seasoned wood in an enclosed space. The smoke hangs in a permanent, eye-stinging haze in the upper half of the room, a low-hanging cloud that deposits a fine layer of black, greasy soot on every surface. The great timbers of the roof are blackened and sticky with years of accumulated creosote. The smell permeates everything. It clings to the coarse wool of their clothes. It works its way deep into the straw of their bedding. It infuses their hair and their skin. A person stepping out of the hut into the clean, cold morning air would carry this scent with them as an invisible cloak. It is a smell so constant that they are likely no longer consciously aware of it, yet it is the foundational note of their entire sensory world, the permanent perfume of home. Beneath this dominant canopy of smoke lies a rich and earthy bouquet of other smells, a complex layering of organic life. There is the damp, mineral scent of the packed earth floor, a cool and ancient smell that rises from the ground itself. Woven into this is the dry, dusty, and slightly sweet scent of the straw that covers the floor and fills the mattress. As the straw ages and begins to slowly decompose under layers of moisture and grime, it takes on a mustier, more complex character, the smell of slow decay. Then there are the animals, each contributing its own powerful signature to the olfactory orchestra. The great, warm bulk of the cow exudes a rich bovine scent, a mixture of warm hide, grassy breath from her cud, and the sharp ammoniac temps of her urine and manure. This is not a faint, distant farm smell. It is an immediate and powerful presence, filling the space around her. The pig, nestled near the hearth, adds its own pungent, more assertive odor. The smaller animals, the goats or sheep, bring a musky, lanolin-rich scent, the smell of raw wool and animal oil. The chickens roosting in the rafters contribute a faint, dry, dusty smell of feathers. To our noses, the combination would be an overwhelming, perhaps nauseating, stench. To the family, these are the smells of their wealth, their security, their larder. The smell of the cow is the smell of milk and cheese. The smell of the pig is the smell of bacon and preserved meat for the lean months ahead. These are the smells of life itself, a potent and reassuring confirmation that their food source is safe and warm beside them. Finally, there is the smell of humanity. In a world without regular bathing, where water was a precious commodity that often had to be hauled by hand and heated laboriously over the fire, and where soap was a harsh, homemade substance of animal fat and ash, people carried their own distinct human scent. It was the smell of sweat from a long day's labor, of the natural oils of the skin, of unwashed hair and unlaundered clothes. In the close, communal space of the bed, these individual scents would mingle, creating a warm, animalistic, and deeply intimate aroma of family. The scent of a sleeping child, the familiar scent of a spouse. These were as much a part of the night as the darkness itself. When all these layers are combined, the smoke, the earth, the straw, the livestock, the humans, the air in the hut becomes a thick, complex, and almost tangible medium. To breathe it is to inhale the very essence of medieval peasant life. If the world of smell is rich and overwhelming, the world of sound is one of subtlety and nuance. The loudest and most constant sound is the voice of the wind outside. It is a living entity, a restless spirit that prowls around the small hut. It moans a low, mournful song as it flows over the thatched roof. It whistles a high, sharp tune as it finds the tiny cracks and gaps in the wattle and daub walls. During a storm, it rises to a terrifying roar, a physical force that makes the great timbers of the frame groan and creak in protest. The family would be intimately familiar with the voice of the wind. They could likely tell its direction and its strength just from the sounds it made as it battered their home. It is the great, untamed sound of the wilderness that surrounds them. Inside the hut, the sounds are small, intimate, and organic. The fire, even when banked for the night, is not silent. It makes a soft, whispering sound. A pocket of gas in a smoldering log will pop with a gentle fate. An ember will collapse with a faint, crackling hiss. These are the quiet heartbeats of the hut's warmth. The other sounds are those of life. There is the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing from the sleeping pile, a chorus of inhalations and exhalations that rise and fall together. A sleeper turns, and the straw mattress responds with a loud, dry rustle, a sound that is as characteristic of the bed as its smell. A child mutters in their sleep. A father lets out a soft snore. A mother coughs gently in the smoky air. The animals, too, contribute their own voices to the nightly choir. The cow's rhythmic chewing of her cud is a wet, meditative, grinding sound, a deeply calming and pastoral noise. She shifts her weight, and her hooves make a soft, dull scuff on the earthen floor. The pig snuffles in its sleep, a series of wet, piggy grunts and sighs. From the rafters, a chicken might rustle its feathers with a sound like dry leaves. These are the sounds of contented life, a background hum of biological activity that is as reassuring as the presence of a sleeping guard. In the deep quiet of the watch, the period of wakefulness between sleeps, the silence would feel immense and profound. The absence of the constant noise of our modern world, no humming refrigerators, no traffic, no electronic beeps would make every small sound stand out in sharp relief. The sound of a mouse scrabbling in the thatch, the drip of melting frost from the eaves, the sound of one's own blood pulsing in one's ears, these would be the only landmarks in a vast ocean of quiet. The sense of touch is perhaps the most immediate and visceral of all. It is a world of texture and temperature. The overriding sensation is the damp, pervasive cold. It is not just in the air. It feels as if it radiates from the very walls and the floor. It is a living presence, a constant pressure on the body. Any part of the skin exposed to the air would feel its sharp, biting sting. The simple act of getting out of the bed to tend the fire would be a physical shock. The cold of the packed earth floor, a jolt to the system. Within the bed, the world is a landscape of rough and uneven textures. The straw of the mattress is prickly and sharp, its dry stalks poking through the coarse fabric of the tick. The linen or hemp of the sheet is not soft or smooth, but abrasive, with a rough, nubby texture that is a constant, low-level irritant against the skin. The woolen blankets are the most dominant tactile sensation. They are heavy, their weight a comforting, pressing presence that feels like a physical shield. The texture is not the soft fluff of a modern blanket, but a dense, coarse, slightly oily feel. The wool is scratchy, another constant source of sensory input. And woven into all these textures is the feeling of other bodies. The warmth is the primary sensation, a deep, life-giving heat that is the antithesis of the cold air. But there is also the pressure, the weight of a limb, the solid presence of another person's back or shoulder. It is a constant, reassuring, and sometimes suffocating, physical connection. The search for warmth is also a tactile journey, the feeling of tucking one's cold feet under the leg of a warmer sibling, the simple comfort of pressing closer to the warm core of the sleeping pile. Finally, there is the visual world, which is largely a world of absence. The darkness in the hut is profound and absolute. Once the fire is banked and the last flame has died, the only light is a faint, residual glow from the embers, a soft, deep red that pulses like a dying heart. This glow is not enough to illuminate the room. It is just enough to create a landscape of deep shadows and indistinct shapes. The faces of the sleeping family are invisible, their forms mere mounds under the blankets. The familiar objects of the room, the cooking pot, the spinning wheel, dissolve into mysterious, looming silhouettes. The darkness is not empty. It is thick and tangible, a medium in which the other senses become heightened. The ears strain to interpret every creak and rustle. The skin becomes more sensitive to the slightest draft. The imagination, unconstrained by visual data, is free to populate the shadows with whatever fears or wonders it can conjure. If one were to wake during the watch and look up, a faint ghostly light might be visible from the smoke hole in the roof. On a clear moonlit night, a soft silver-grey beam might lance down through the smoky air, a celestial spotlight that made the dust motes dance. This single, ethereal column of light, in the otherwise total blackness, would have a powerful, almost mystical quality. It was a connection to the world outside, a reminder of the vast, cold, and beautiful cosmos that arched over their small, smoky shelter. This is the world the family inhabits for half of their lives during the winter. It is a world that is simultaneously harsh and intimate, disgusting and comforting, terrifying and peaceful. It is a world that demands a complete and constant engagement of all the senses. To survive and sleep in this hut was to be a part of a rich, organic, and intensely alive environment. To understand this sensory world is to understand, in a small way, the very texture of their existence. We hope that this deep immersion into the sounds, smells, and feelings of a medieval night helps to transport you from your own world and guide you towards a state of deep and profound rest. If you find that these journeys help to quiet your mind, please consider subscribing for more explorations designed for relaxation. For now, let the complex sensations of this past world fade, and allow yourself to sink into the simple, quiet darkness of your own peaceful night. The arrival of the deep winter brought with it a profound and fundamental shift in the very rhythm of life, a great slowing that was both a hardship and a blessing. For a medieval peasant family, whose existence was lashed to the relentless turning of the agricultural year, winter was a season of paradox. The same cold that threatened their lives also released them from the back-breaking sun-up to sundown labor that dominated the rest of the year. The agrarian calendar was not a mere schedule. It was a tyrannical master, and in winter, that master finally slept. The fields, which for months had demanded every ounce of their energy, were now silent and inaccessible, locked away under a hard, frozen blanket of earth and snow. This was the fallow season, a time of enforced rest, not just for the land, but for the people who worked it. The frantic, communal energy of the autumn harvest was a distant memory. The last of the grain had been threshed, winnowed, and stored, a hoard of precious calories that represented the family's hope for survival. The scythes and sickles that had swung for weeks on end now hung cold and silent on the wall of the hut. The endless days of plowing, that grueling work of guiding the heavy wooden plow through the soil, of urging the weary oxen forward, were impossible now. The ground was not merely hard. It was transformed into a substance as unyielding as iron. To attempt to plow it would be to risk breaking the precious iron plowshare, a catastrophic loss that would cripple the family's ability to plant in the spring. The time for sowing, for casting the seed upon the earth with a prayer, was long past. The seeds themselves, the very future of the family, lay dormant and protected in clay pots or sacks, waiting for the world to thaw. The constant, aching demands of the land had ceased. This cessation of field labor represented the single greatest change in the family's daily life. The physical toll of the agricultural season was immense. It was a life of repetitive, strenuous motion that wore down the body, leaving a legacy of chronic pain in the back, the knees, and the hands. Winter, in its own harsh way, was a time for healing. The muscles, strained and torn by months of heavy lifting and stooping, were finally given a chance to recover. The deep calluses on the hands, built up from the friction of wooden tool handles, might soften slightly. The body, pushed to the brink of its endurance by the harvest, could now retreat, conserve its energy, and slowly begin to mend. This was not a period of idleness, for true idleness was a luxury that did not exist in their world. But the nature of the work shifted dramatically. It moved from the vast, open expanse of the fields to the cramped, smoky confines of the single-room hut. The scale of the labor became smaller, more meticulous, and more intimately connected to the immediate needs of the household. The day's new rhythm began with the animals. The livestock, their living, breathing partners in survival, could not be ignored. Their needs were a non-negotiable daily reality. At the first hint of dawn, the father or mother would rise from the communal bed to tend to them. The cow, their most valuable asset, needed to be milked. This was a cold-fingered task in the frigid morning air. The milk, still warm from the cow's body, was a precious gift, a source of vital fat and protein. It would be carefully strained and stored. The animals also needed to be fed. The hay, harvested in the summer and stored in a small loft or a protected corner of the hut, had to be carefully rationed. Each day's portion would be forked out, its dry, sweet smell a reminder of the sunnier months. The supply was finite, and making it last until the spring thaw was a constant source of low-level anxiety. The cow, the goats, the pig each needed to be given its share of fodder and water. Fetching water was one of the most arduous winter chores. If the nearby stream or well froze over, a hole would have to be smashed through the ice, a brutal and chilling task. The health of the animals was a matter of constant vigilance. A sick cow in the middle of winter, with no fresh pasture and limited remedies, was a potential disaster. The family would watch them closely, their well-being as important as that of any human member of the household. After the animals, the next great demand of the winter day was the fire. The central hearth was a hungry god that needed to be constantly fed. The management of firewood was a critical skill, a form of winter artistry. The woodpile, located just outside the door, was the family's primary measure of security. A large, well-stocked woodpile was a source of immense psychological comfort. But that would had to be brought inside, split, and dried. Each day, the father, or one of the older sons, would make trips to the woodpile, returning with armloads of logs covered in snow. This wood was often damp, and would not burn well. A space near the hearth was always reserved for a small stack of logs, slowly drying in the radiant heat of the fire. The process of splitting the logs into smaller, more manageable pieces was another daily chore, usually done outside on a milder day, or in a sheltered spot. The sharp, percussive thwack of the axe striking the wood was one of the characteristic sounds of a winter village. The skill lay in reading the grain of the wood, in placing the axe just right to achieve a clean split with a minimum of effort. This work, while demanding, was a satisfying, rhythmic task that produced an immediate and tangible result. Fuel for warmth, fuel for life. With the animals tended and the fire fed, the long hours of the winter day could be devoted to the season of repair and creation. Winter was the time to fix what the summer had broken. The tools that had been used so relentlessly during the planting and harvest season were now brought into the light of the fire for inspection and mending. The heavy wooden plow would be carefully examined. Its wooden frame might have cracks that needed to be patched or reinforced. The leather harness for the oxen would be checked for wear, and any frayed straps would be painstakingly stitched and re-oiled with animal fat to keep the leather from cracking in the cold. The iron plowshare, the cutting edge of the plow, might have become dull or chipped. It would be sharpened with a whetstone, a slow, abrasive process, or, if the damage was severe, it might require a trip to the village blacksmith, a journey that would be undertaken with care on a day when the paths were clear. Other tools received the same meticulous attention. The wooden handles of sickles and scythes, worn smooth and thin from 1001 grips, might be replaced. This was a task for a patient hand, carving a new handle from a piece of ash or hazel, shaping it to fit the user's grasp, and carefully fitting it to the metal blade. Wooden rakes with broken teeth would be repaired, new teeth carved and fitted into the head. The flails used for threshing grain, with their leather hinges, would be inspected and strengthened. Every act of repair was an investment in the future, an act of faith that spring would come again and that these tools would be needed once more. This work was quiet, focused, and deeply personal. A man's tools were an extension of his body, and he knew their every flaw and virtue. Winter was the time to honor this relationship, to restore them to wholeness. While the men were often occupied with wood and tools, the women of the household were engaged in a different but equally vital form of winter production, the creation of textiles. The long, dark months were the time for turning the raw materials of the farm into the cloth that would clothe and warm the family. This was a long and multi-stage process that dominated the female world of the hut. It began with the raw wool, which had been shorn from the sheep in the spring or summer. It was a greasy, dirty mass, full of lanolin, dirt, and bits of vegetable matter. The wool first had to be cleaned, a process of washing it in tubs of warm water and lye soap, and then laid out to dry. Once clean and dry, it had to be carded. This involved combing the tangled clumps of wool between two wooden paddles, called cards, which were covered with a grid of fine metal teeth. This repetitive, rhythmic motion teased the fibers apart, aligning them into a soft, airy roll called a rollag, which was now ready for spinning. Spinning was the quintessential winter task. For countless hours, the woman of the house, her mother, and her daughters would be occupied with the spindle or the spinning wheel. The drop spindle, a simple tool consisting of a weighted whirl and a shaft, had been used for thousands of years. The spinner would draw out a few fibers from the rollag, twist them into a thread, and attach them to the spindle. By giving the spindle a sharp twist and letting it drop, the spinner could use its momentum to twist the fibers into a continuous, strong thread. It was an act of profound skill, requiring a delicate touch to draft the fibers at just the right thickness, creating a thread that was even and strong. This was a portable task, one that could be done while standing, walking, or sitting by the fire. It filled the small moments of the day, a constant, quiet hum of productivity. The thread would slowly, satisfyingly accumulate on the spindle, a tangible measure of the hours passed. Once a sufficient amount of thread was spun, it could be woven into cloth. If the family owned a loom, it would be a large, cumbersome wooden frame that took up a significant amount of space in the already crowded hut. Weaving was a more stationary and complex task. The long warp threads had to be carefully set up on the loom, a painstaking process that could take a full day. Then, the weaving itself could begin. The weaver would pass a shuttle, carrying a bobbin of the weft thread, back and forth between the warp threads, using heddles controlled by foot pedals to raise and lower different sets of threads to create the over and under pattern of the cloth. The process was rhythmic and percussive. The clatter of the heddles, the swish of the shuttle, the solid thump of the beater pressing the new weft thread tightly into place. Slowly, miraculously, line by line, the fabric would grow. This cloth was the family's most essential protection against the cold. It would become their tunics, their blankets, their hosen. every inch of it was imbued with the labor of their own hands. As the short, dim day faded into the long, dark evening, the time for this meticulous work would end. The hut would be plunged into a profound darkness, broken only by the warm, living light of the hearth. With the shutters barred and the world outside locked away, the family would gather around the fire. This was the time when the hut was transformed from a workshop into a home. The hearth was the social heart of their world, the stage for the nightly rituals of family life. It was a time for storytelling. The elders of the family, the grandparents, would be the keepers of the old tales. They would recount the stories of local saints, the folk tales of cunning animals and foolish giants, the cautionary tales of what happens to those who wander too far into the woods on a winter night. These stories were not just entertainment. They were the family's library, their school, their moral compass. They passed on the wisdom, the fears, and the beliefs of their ancestors. It was also a time for riddles and simple games. A board for 9 men's Morris might be scratched into a piece of wood, or even onto the stone hearth itself. Played with pebbles or beans, dice carved from bone, could be used for simple games of chance. A father might take out a simple flute, carved from a reed, and play a mournful, familiar tune. The family might sing songs together, old ballads, whose verses they all knew by heart. In these moments, huddled in the small circle of firelight, surrounded by the immense and silent darkness, the bonds of family were forged and reinforced. It was a time for teaching and learning. A mother guiding her daughter's clumsy hands as she learned to spin. A father showing his son the proper way to mend a net. The enforced proximity of winter, while it could sometimes lead to friction in the cramped space, also created a deep and powerful intimacy. In this way, the paradox of winter was lived out each day. It was a time of hardship, of cold, and of the constant threat of hunger. But it was also a time of recovery, of repair, and of community. The body healed from the wounds of the harvest. The tools were made ready for the spring. The family, freed from the scattering demands of the fields, was drawn together around the fire. The work of winter was a quiet, hopeful investment in the future. Every repaired tool, every spindleful of thread, every story told, was an act of defiance against the darkness, a testament to the belief that the cold was not eternal, and that the sun would, eventually, return to warm the earth once more. We hope this exploration of the winter's quiet industry brings you a sense of peace and purpose. If these journeys into the rhythms of the past help you to find your own rest, please consider subscribing to our channel for more. For now, let the idea of this purposeful quiet settle over you, and allow it to guide you into a deep and restorative sleep. The great, silent wheel of the night begins its final turn. The deepest, darkest hours, the domain of the watch, and the quiet stirrings between sleeps, have passed. The family, having long since returned to the communal pallet, is now sunk in their second sleep. This secundus somnus was often described in medieval texts as a different country from the first. The initial plunge into unconsciousness after a long day's labor was a heavy, almost bottomless state of oblivion, a true death of the self. The second sleep, however, was a lighter, more buoyant realm. It was the territory of dreams, a landscape where the mind, partly rested, could begin to weave its strange and vivid tapestries. The anxieties of the day, the memories of summers past, the ghostly figures of folklore, all could mingle and dance in the theater of the sleeping mind. It was a sleep that was closer to the surface, a state of readiness for the inevitable return of the day. There is no external sound that signals the beginning of the end of the night. There are no chiming clocks, no crowing roosters heralding a false dawn. The rhythm of waking is an internal one, a biological clock deeply and irrevocably synchronized with the great, slow cycles of the natural world. This internal clock is attuned not to a specific hour, but to a subtle shift in the quality of the light, a change so gradual that a modern, city-dwelling human would be completely oblivious to it. The first signal is not a light that can be seen, but one that is felt, a faint dilution of the absolute blackness. The pitch-black ink of the deepest night begins to thin, turning to a shade of charcoal gray. This imperceptible shift is the signal, the first whisper of the approaching sun, still hours below the frozen horizon. The change in light is registered through the eyelids, through the chinks in the wooden shutters, through the smoke hole in the roof. The body, even in sleep, perceives it. The brain begins to transition, slowly pulling the sleepers up from the depths of their dreams. It is not a sudden jolt, but a gentle, upward drift towards consciousness. The first to stir is likely one of the parents, the mother or the father, the ones whose bodies are most attuned to the responsibilities of the household. It begins with a subtle change in their breathing, a slight restlessness under the heavy blankets. The dream state dissolves, and the first sensation to break through is the cold. It is a profound and penetrating cold, for the hut is now at its most frigid point. The fire in the hearth, so carefully banked hours ago, has burned down to its last embers. The heat-storing stones, tucked into the bed, have long since given up their warmth and are now just cold, hard lumps in the straw. The collective body heat of the family has kept their small cocoon under the blankets from freezing, but the air in the room itself is bitterly cold, likely below the freezing point. The moisture from their own breath has condensed and frozen on the inside of the walls, painting them with a delicate, crystalline layer of frost. The parent who is waking lies still for a moment, gathering themselves. To move is to invite the cold in, to break the fragile seal of warmth. They can feel the solid, sleeping forms of their children pressed against them. They can hear the soft, even breathing that assures them all is well. But the duty of the morning cannot be delayed. With a silent act of will, the parent begins the slow, deliberate process of extraction. They carefully, inch by inch, begin to slide out from the human pile, trying not to disturb the others and, most importantly, trying to pull as little of the precious blanket warmth with them as possible. As they emerge from under the heavy wool and hide coverings, the cold attacks them with a physical shock. It is a sharp, biting sensation on their exposed skin, their face and hands. Their breath instantly condenses in a thick, white cloud. The transition from the warm, close, human-smelling nest of the bed to the frigid, smoky air of the room is a brutal one. Their first and most critical task is the resurrection of the fire. The fate of the day, its warmth and its food, depends on this single act. Barefoot, they move across the icy, packed earth floor. Their feet, accustomed to this daily shock, register the cold but do not flinch. They crouch before the central hearth. What was a gentle glow hours ago is now a landscape of grey ash, with a few, tiny, winking eyes of red at its very core. The embers are still alive, but only just. This is the moment of truth. If the fire has been banked properly, the heart of it will still be hot. If not, if the embers have died completely, the morning will begin with the arduous and frustrating task of starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel, a process that could take a considerable amount of time in the damp cold. Using a stick or a small, poker-like piece of iron, the parent gently probes the ash, carefully scraping it away to expose the glowing heart. A faint warmth radiates from the small, precious core of heat. They lean down close, their face just inches from the ash, and begin to blow. It is a gentle, controlled breath, not a strong puff. The goal is to introduce oxygen slowly, to coax the embers back to life, not to blow them out or scatter them. The first few breaths seem to have no effect. Then, a few of the embers begin to glow a little brighter, from a dull red to a brighter orange. The parent continues to blow, a steady, rhythmic stream of air. It is an act of intimacy with the fire, a form of respiratory resuscitation. As the embers brighten, a tiny, fragile wisp of smoke curls upwards. Now, the kindling must be introduced. A small, precious bundle of the driest materials has been kept ready for this exact moment, perhaps in a niche in the wall near the hearth. This kindling is a carefully curated collection, a handful of bone-dry moss, some paper-thin shavings of wood, a few wisps of straw, and a collection of the smallest, driest twigs, no thicker than a finger. The parent takes a tiny pinch of the moss and places it directly onto the brightest of the glowing embers. They lean in and blow again, more urgently this time. The moss begins to smolder, releasing a thick white smoke. Then, with a sudden magical whoosh, it catches, and a tiny yellow flame, no bigger than a thumbnail, flickers into existence. It is a moment of quiet triumph, the first victory of the new day. This tiny flame is a fragile newborn that must be nurtured. The parent carefully adds the smallest twigs, one by one, arranging them in a small pyramid over the flame, leaving plenty of space for air to circulate. The flame licks at the twigs, and they begin to catch, crackling softly. The light grows, pushing the deep shadows back a few inches, painting the parent's focused face in flickering shades of orange and gold. As the kindling fire grows stronger, larger pieces of wood can be added, logs that have been drying by the hearth all night. The fire is reborn. its light begins to fill the small hut, and its warmth begins its slow, steady battle against the room's deep chill. The sound of the crackling wood is the true sound of the morning, a cheerful and promising noise that signals the end of the night's siege. The growing light and the sound of the reviving fire begin to stir the rest of the household. In the communal bed, small bodies begin to move. A child coughs, another mutters and turns, burrowing deeper into the warm nest. The parent by the fire might call out a soft good morning, their voice the first human sound of the day. The waking of the children is a slow, reluctant process. They are loath to leave the only truly warm place in their world. One of the challenges of the morning is to coax them out from under the covers and into the cold air. A common technique is to use the fire itself. A parent might take the children's clothes, their small woolen tunics, and hold them up to the growing flames. The wool, cold and slightly damp from the night air, would quickly warm up, the heat driving out the chill. The prospect of putting on warm clothes, rather than cold ones, was a powerful incentive to get out of bed. Another trick was for the children to pull their clothes for the day down into the bed with them, warming them with their own body heat for a few minutes before braving the cold to get dressed. Getting dressed itself is a brisk and functional affair. There is no privacy. The children and adults alike simply stand up, perhaps turning towards the fire, and pull on their daily garments. The layers go on quickly: the linen undertunic, the woolen outer tunic, the hosen for the men and boys. The goal is to cover the skin and trap the body's warmth as quickly as possible. While the hut is slowly warming and the family is getting dressed, the first meal of the day is prepared. This is almost invariably a form of pottage, the staple food of the medieval peasant. The mother would take the large iron cooking pot, which was suspended over the fire from a hook or a tripod, and begin to fill it. She would add a measure of grain, perhaps oats or barley, saved from the previous day's cooking. To this she would add water, fetched in a wooden bucket from the barrel inside the hut. The contents of the pottage pot were rarely, if ever, emptied completely. It was a perpetual stew. Each day, new ingredients were added to the remnants of the day before, creating a complex, ever-evolving flavor. In the winter, the additions would be meager: a handful of dried peas, a few slices of a tough winter cabbage, or a leek from the small garden patch, perhaps a bit of salted meat or fish if the family was fortunate. The pot would be swung over the fire, and as the hut slowly filled with the warm, savory smell of the cooking pottage, the last vestiges of sleep would finally recede. While the pottage is heating, other morning chores begin. The chamber pot, used during the night, needs to be emptied. This is a quick and unpleasant task, a brisk trip to the designated waste pit or midden heap outside the hut. The sight that greets the person stepping outside is one of a world transformed. The landscape is painted in shades of grey and white. The snow is pristine and unmarked. The air is so cold that it feels sharp and crystalline in the lungs. The silence is profound, broken only by the crunch of their own feet in the snow. Back inside, the hut is now a hive of quiet activity. The sleeping area must be dealt with. The heavy blankets and hides are thrown back to allow the straw mattress to air out. The tick might be carried to the door and given a vigorous shaking to fluff up the compressed straw and dislodge some of the dust and fleas. The earthen floor around the hearth might be given a cursory sweep with a besom, a simple broom made from a bundle of twigs tied to a stick. The animals, now fully awake and hungry, become more demanding, their low moans and grunts a clear call for attention. The family gathers around the fire to eat their morning meal. There is no table and chairs. They simply sit on low stools, on the edge of the sleeping platform, or even on the floor itself, holding their wooden bowls in their hands and eating with wooden or horn spoons. The pottage is hot, thick, and nourishing. It is not exciting food, but it is warm, and it fills the belly, providing the necessary energy for the day's work. The conversation is likely minimal, the focus on the simple, comforting act of eating and absorbing the warmth of the fire. With the meal finished, the day's work begins in earnest. The division of labor is clear. The father and any older sons will prepare to head outside. They will add more layers of clothing, a cloak, a woolen cap, and simple leather shoes or boots, perhaps stuffed with straw for extra insulation. Their work for the day might involve checking their traps for any snared rabbits, attempting to gather more firewood from the woods, or carrying out repairs on a fence or an outbuilding. The mother and daughters will remain in the hut. Their day will be filled with the endless tasks of the household: spinning, mending clothes, preparing food, tending to the youngest children. As the father opens the heavy wooden door to step out into the morning, a blast of intensely cold, clean air rushes into the hut. It smells of snow, pine, and the vast, frozen emptiness of the winter landscape. It is a stark contrast to the thick, smoky, and living air of the hut. For a moment, the two worlds meet at the threshold. Then the door is closed, and the drawbar is lifted. The family, having survived another night, now turns to face the challenges of the day. The brief, vulnerable respite of sleep is over, and the conscious, constant work of survival has begun again. This daily resurrection, this emergence from the cold and dark into the light and work of a new day, is the fundamental rhythm of their lives, a cycle repeated endlessly until the great thaw of spring finally arrives. We hope this detailed account of the medieval morning has been a peaceful and interesting journey for you. Observing this slow, deliberate return to life from the depths of a winter night can be a powerful reminder of the simple rhythms that govern our own lives. If you find these historical immersions help you to relax and find peace, please consider subscribing to our channel for more. For now, let the idea of the first warm light and the nourishing meal settle in your mind, and allow yourself to drift in comfort and security. To survive a brutal medieval winter in a small wooden hut was a feat of physical endurance, a victory won through the careful management of heat, the rationing of food, and the resilience of the human body. But alongside this fierce physical battle, an equally important and perhaps even more difficult war was waged, the war within the mind. The psychological toll of the winter season was a formidable and relentless adversary. The constant cold, the oppressive and near-total darkness, the gnawing anxiety of scarcity, and the profound isolation combined to create a mental and emotional siege that lasted for months on end. To endure the winter was not just to keep one's body from freezing, but to keep one's spirit from breaking. This psychological resilience was not an accident. It was a skill, a form of spiritual fortitude cultivated through ritual, community, and the sheer, stubborn power of hope. The most fundamental and corrosive of these psychological pressures was the anxiety of hunger. For a peasant family, the world of winter was a closed system. The food they had in store at the first snowfall was, with very few exceptions, all the food they would have until the spring thaw. The grain bin, the sack of dried peas, the salted meat hanging from the rafters, the few hardy vegetables stored in the root cellar. This was not just their larder, it was their hourglass, and they could see the sand visibly dwindling with each passing day. This knowledge was a constant, low-level hum of fear beneath the surface of their daily lives. Every meal was a silent act of calculus, a weighing of immediate need against the terrifying uncertainty of the future. The woman of the house, as she scooped the oats for the morning pottage, would be performing this calculation in her mind. Was the scoop too generous? Would taking a little less today mean the difference between having food in March and having none? Her hands would know the weight of the grain sack, and she would feel its lightness growing week by week, a tangible measure of their dwindling security. This was not an abstract concern. It was a visceral one. The family would know the physical sensations of true hunger, the dull, aching emptiness in the belly, the lightheadedness, the pervasive weakness that made every chore feel 100 times harder. This anxiety of scarcity colored every aspect of their sensory world. The sound of a mouse scrabbling in the thatch at night was not a mere annoyance. It was the sound of a thief, a tiny monster come to steal their very lifeblood. A spill of precious flour on the floor would be a moment of genuine distress, the white powder carefully scraped up from the dirt. The sight of mold beginning to form on a stored cabbage would be a small but significant tragedy. The children's complaints of hunger, their simple, honest expressions of need, would be a source of deep and aching pain for the parents, a feeling of failure and helplessness in the face of the implacable season. This constant, low-grade stress would have frayed nerves and shortened tempers. The enclosed space of the hut, already thick with smoke, would have also been thick with this unspoken tension, the shared, communal fear of the empty pot. Layered on top of this anxiety of hunger was the profound psychological oppression of the darkness and the cold. The modern world is saturated with light. We have banished the night, reducing it to a mere inconvenience. For the medieval peasant, the night was a vast, powerful, and unconquerable empire. With the sun setting in the mid-afternoon, the family was plunged into a profound darkness that would last for some 16 hours. The fire provided a small, flickering island of light, but its reach was short. Beyond the small circle of its glow, the world dissolved into an impenetrable blackness. This was not a peaceful darkness. It was a canvas upon which the anxieties and fears of the medieval mind could paint their most terrifying creations. The human brain is wired to find patterns, to make sense of the unseen. In the deep quiet of the hut, every unexplained sound became a potential threat. The creak of a roof timber under the weight of snow could be the footstep of something unnatural. The moan of the wind through a crack in the wall could be the cry of a restless spirit. The darkness blurred the boundaries between the real and the imagined. This was the world that their folklore and religious beliefs populated with a host of malevolent entities. The stories told around the fire were not just entertainment. They were a form of psychological mapping, an attempt to name and understand the terrors that lurked in the shadows. They spoke of the boggart that hid in the dark corners, the will-o'-the-wisp that led travelers to their doom in the frozen marshes, the demonic spirits that were believed to gain power during the longest nights of the year. These were not abstract fantasies. They were perceived as real and present dangers. To lie awake in the darkness was to feel vulnerable not just to the cold, but to an entire universe of unseen malice. The cold itself was more than a physical sensation. It was a psychological weight. It was a constant, draining presence that sapped the will and the spirit. It made every simple action, from getting out of bed to fetching water, a conscious act of defiance against a hostile universe. The body's constant, unseen effort to maintain its core temperature was a form of perpetual, low-level exhaustion. This physical drain had a direct emotional consequence, leading to a state of lethargy and a dulling of the spirit that we might today call seasonal depression. The world outside the hut was a landscape of sensory deprivation. The vibrant greens and browns of summer were gone, replaced by a stark, almost featureless palette of white snow and grey sky. This visual monotony, this lack of color and life, would have a profound effect on the mind, reinforcing the feeling of being trapped in a dead and unchanging world. The cold was an enemy that could not be fought, only endured, and its relentless, oppressive presence was a daily test of a person's mental fortitude. This sense of being under siege was amplified by the profound isolation of the winter months. A heavy snowfall could cut the village off from the rest of the world for weeks at a time, turning it into a snowbound island. The familiar paths to the next village, to the market town, to the distant mill, would disappear, buried under an impassable sea of white. This isolation fostered a powerful sense of us against the world, a deep reliance on the immediate community. But it also created a form of cabin fever on a communal scale. This paradox of isolation and forced intimacy was most acutely felt within the hut itself. The family was a self-contained unit, their only society for days or weeks on end. This constant, unceasing proximity was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was a source of immense comfort and security. The shared warmth, the familiar presence of loved ones, the collective struggle against the common enemy of winter ore. This forged powerful bonds of interdependence and affection. But there was no escape. There was no concept of personal space or privacy. Every cough, every snore, every sigh, every bodily smell was a shared experience. The small irritations of daily life, a child's incessant whining, a disagreement between spouses, a grandparent's repetitive complaints, could not be escaped by simply going to another room. There were no other rooms. These small frictions, with no outlet, could fester in the smoky air, growing into unspoken resentments. The hut, their sanctuary, could also feel like a prison, its walls pressing in on them. The same faces day after day, the same stories, the same smells, the same view of a snow-choked world through the tiny, shuttered window. How, then, did they endure? What were the psychological tools, the anchors of the mind, that kept them from succumbing to despair? The most powerful of these was faith. In the medieval world, religion was not a private belief system or a Sunday obligation. It was the fundamental operating system of reality. The church calendar provided the primary structure for the year, and it offered crucial points of light in the long winter darkness. The season of Advent, with its promise of the coming of the light, was a period of hopeful anticipation. The 12 days of Christmas, a midwinter festival that was the most important holiday of the year, was a sanctioned period of rest, feasting, and celebration. It was a deliberate, communal act of defiance against the gloom, a time to burn the Yule log, to eat the precious preserved meats, to sing, and to reaffirm social bonds. Other points of light, like the Feast of Candlemas in early February, which marked the return of the light and was a traditional forecast for the end of winter, served as crucial psychological milestones, breaking the monotonous expanse of the season into manageable segments. On a daily level, faith provided a framework of meaning and a set of rituals that imposed order on a chaotic world. The simple act of making the sign of the cross, the recitation of the Paternoster, or an Ave Maria, these were not empty gestures. They were small acts of power, affirmations of a divine order in a world that felt hostile and disordered. The belief in a benevolent God, in the protection of the saints and one's guardian angel, was a powerful shield against the supernatural terrors of the night. It provided a counter-narrative to the folklore of demons and goblins. The local church, with its stone walls and its holy icons, was a symbol of permanence and divine protection in a fragile world. Faith provided the ultimate answer to the question of suffering. It was a test, a trial, and its endurance was a path to salvation. This belief did not eliminate the hardship, but it gave it a profound and powerful meaning. The second great anchor was community. The isolation of the village also created a fierce interdependence. Self-reliance was a fantasy. The reality was mutual reliance. When a path became blocked by a deep snowdrift, the men of the village would work together to clear it. If one family's food stores ran dangerously low, a neighbor might share a portion of their own. Knowing that the situation could easily be reversed the following year, the women would gather together to spin, their shared labor a context for conversation, gossip, and mutual support. These were not grand acts of charity. They were the essential, unwritten laws of a society where the well-being of the individual was inextricably linked to the well-being of the group. The knowledge that one was not alone in their struggle, that every other family in the village was facing the same fears and enduring the same hardships, created a powerful sense of solidarity that was a potent antidote to despair. Finally, there was the stubborn, unquenchable power of hope, a hope that was embodied in the promise of spring. For the medieval peasant, the return of spring was not just a change of seasons, it was a form of resurrection. It was an article of faith, a cyclical truth as powerful and as certain as the rising of the sun. This hope was not passive. It was an active, working principle that gave purpose to the monotonous labor of the winter months. Every tool that was mended was an act of faith in the future thaw. Every length of thread that was spun was a preparation for the world to come. Every story told to a child was a link in a chain that connected them to the past and projected them into the future. They looked for the signs of the coming change with an acuity we can barely imagine. The subtle shift in the angle of the sun, the first sound of dripping water from the eaves, the return of a particular bird. These were not just natural phenomena, they were prophecies, the first stirrings of a world being reborn. This unwavering belief in the cycle, in the eventual and inevitable defeat of the winter, was the ultimate psychological anchor. It allowed them to endure the darkness and the cold, not as a permanent state, but as a temporary trial, a long night that would, without fail, be broken by the dawn. We hope this exploration of the medieval mind's struggle for peace and endurance has been a meaningful journey. Understanding the immense inner strength required to survive their world can, in a strange way, help us to find a sense of perspective and calm in our own. If you find these deep dives into the human spirit of the past to be a source of rest and reflection, we invite you to subscribe to our channel for more. For now, let the idea of this profound resilience settle over you, and may it guide you toward a night of deep and untroubled peace. Our long journey through the medieval winter night is drawing to a close. We have shared the smoky air of the hut, felt the bite of the cold, and understood the complex tapestry of warmth and fear that defined the hours of darkness. Now, as the family in our story faces the work of a new day, let us cast our minds forward, not just to the next night, but through the remaining weeks and months of the unrelenting cold. Let us imagine the slow, almost imperceptible turning of the great wheel of the seasons, the gradual and triumphant return of the sun, and the profound transformation of the world that was known as the thaw. For a people who had endured a months-long siege, the arrival of spring was not a gentle transition. It was a dramatic and joyous liberation, a form of collective resurrection. The end of winter does not announce itself with a single, grand event. It is a slow, incremental process, a series of small, almost secret signs that are noticed only by those who have been desperately waiting for them. The first and most significant of these signs is the change in the light. Sometime in the bleak heart of February, A person stepping out of the hut in the late afternoon would notice a subtle but undeniable difference. The sun, which for months had been a weak, watery disk that barely skimmed the southern horizon, now seems to hang in the sky for a few precious moments longer. The quality of its light, though still pale, has a sharper edge to it. The long blue shadows it casts across the snow seem a little shorter. This gradual lengthening of the days is the first crack in winter's armor, a celestial promise that the reign of darkness is beginning to wane. This change is not just observed, it is felt in the very bones, a primal biological response to the return of the light. Inside the hut, this small increase in daylight hours is a gift of immeasurable value. The dim, smoky interior is illuminated for a little longer each day, allowing the meticulous work of spinning, weaving, and mending to continue without the need to burn precious tallow candles. The psychological effect is even more profound. The longer days begin to break the oppressive monotony of the long nights, recalibrating the rhythms of sleep and waking, and lifting the heavy blanket of seasonal lethargy that has settled over the family's spirits. The next sign is the sound of water. For months, the world has been locked in a silent, solid state. The streams and rivers have been stilled, their voices silenced under a thick carapace of ice. The only sounds have been the dry rustle of the wind and the crunch of feet on snow. Then, on a day when the sun feels almost warm on the face, a new sound enters the world. It is the soft, musical plink, plink, plink of dripping water. Icicles that have hung like great fangs from the eaves of the thatched roof begin to weep. The snow on the sunny side of the hut's roof begins to soften and slide. This sound of melting is the most beautiful music in the world. It is the sound of the great unlocking, the first audible proof that the iron grip of the frost is weakening. Soon, this gentle dripping is joined by a more powerful voice. The streams begin to stir. At first, it is just a trickle of meltwater running over the surface of the ice. But as the days grow warmer, the ice itself begins to groan and crack. Great fissures appear, and then, with a thunderous roar, the ice breaks apart. The river, which has been in a state of suspended animation, is suddenly and violently reborn. It becomes a churning brown torrent, carrying great, grinding plates of ice downstream. This is a dangerous and destructive time, a period of floods and chaos. But it is also a time of exhilarating power, a dramatic and undeniable sign that the world is coming back to life. As the snow begins to recede, the land is revealed once more, but it is a transformed landscape. The pristine uniform white gives way to a messy, mottled patchwork of brown and green. The earth, which has been hidden for so long, reappears, dark, wet, and smelling of life. The scent of the thaw is as powerful and evocative as the sound of it. It is the rich, complex, and deeply fertile smell of damp soil, of decaying leaves, of the very reawakening of the microbial universe. After months of breathing the sterile crystalline air of the deep freeze, this smell of wet earth is an intoxicating perfume, a promise of the growth and abundance to come. For the family, the thaw brings a cascade of changes to their daily lives. The world outside the hut is no longer a hostile territory, to be entered only when absolutely necessary. It becomes a place of opportunity and renewed activity. The paths to the neighbors' huts reappear, and with them, the social world of the village reawakens. People emerge from their smoky burrows, blinking in the strengthening sunlight. The sound of voices and laughter returns to the air. The oppressive isolation of the deep winter dissolves, replaced by a renewed sense of community and shared purpose. The work of the family moves outdoors once more. The father and sons will inspect the fields, their experienced eyes assessing the condition of the soil, their hands feeling its texture, judging when it will be dry enough to take the plow. They will clear the winter's debris from their small garden plot, their toft, preparing the beds for the first hardy greens. The woman of the house will seize the opportunity of the longer, warmer days to begin the great spring cleaning. The heavy woolen blankets, the straw-filled mattress ticks, the family's few garments, all will be taken outside. They will be beaten with sticks to dislodge the accumulated dust, grime, and vermin of the long winter. They will be hung on lines or spread on bushes to air out in the wind and the sun. This is not just a cleaning. It is a ritual of purification, a symbolic casting out of the darkness and stagnation of the winter months. The hut itself will be thrown open, the shutters unbarred, the door left ajar, allowing the fresh, clean air of spring to flush out the thick, smoky atmosphere of the winter. The thaw is a time of immense relief, but it is also a time of great peril. This period, known as the hungry gap, is often the most dangerous time of the year. The family's winter stores are now at their lowest point. The grain sack is frighteningly light. The last of the salted meat has been eaten. The stored vegetables are gone, but the new food of the spring has not yet arrived. The seeds have not even been planted. This is the period when the careful rationing of the winter months faces its ultimate test. Malnutrition is a real and present danger, and the family's weakened bodies are highly susceptible to disease. The first wild greens that appear, the tender shoots of nettles and wild garlic, are not just a welcome change of diet. They are a vital source of nourishment, a life-saving medicine from the reawakening earth. But hope is now a tangible thing. The sounds of life are returning to the landscape. The birds, which have been silent or absent, return in great, noisy flocks. Their songs fill the morning air, a complex and joyous symphony that replaces the mournful moan of the winter wind. The first brave insects begin to emerge. In the woods, the tight, hard buds on the trees begin to swell, a visible sign of the life force rising within them. The family, like the trees, feels this same rising sap. Their energy, which has been in a state of semi-hibernation, returns. The world is full of work to be done, but it is a hopeful, forward-looking work, the work of creation, not just of endurance. The plough is brought out from its winter storage, its iron share cleaned and sharpened. The oxen are led from the hut, their bodies thin after the lean winter, and hitched to the plough. The moment when the ploughshare first bites into the soft, damp earth of the spring is a moment of profound significance, a ritual act that begins the great cycle of the agricultural year anew. Our journey through the medieval winter night, which began in the deep darkness and the biting cold, has brought us at last to this moment of renewal and hope. We have shared a glimpse into a forgotten world of sleep, a world where warmth was a precious currency, where darkness was a living presence, and where survival was a nightly achievement. We have seen that the simple wooden hut was not a primitive hovel, but a sophisticated survival machine. We have learned that the central hearth was both a source of life and a constant danger. We have understood that the communal bed was a strategy of collective warmth, and that the presence of animals was a vital part of the hut's thermal economy. We have rediscovered the lost rhythm of segmented sleep, with its quiet, reflective interlude of the watch. We have felt the psychological weight of the darkness and the cold, and we have witnessed the profound resilience of the human spirit in the face of immense hardship. The world of this peasant family is, in so many ways, unimaginably distant from our own. We are separated from them by a great chasm of technology, of comfort, of scientific understanding. Our nights are filled with light. Our homes are warmed at the touch of a button. Our food is readily available in all seasons. We have conquered the cold and banished the darkness that so utterly dominated their lives. And yet, for all these differences, the fundamental human experience of sleep connects us to them across the centuries. The need for warmth, for security, for a safe place to surrender to the vulnerability of unconsciousness, is a timeless and universal human constant. In their world, sleep was a fragile and hard-won state, a brief respite in a life of constant struggle. In our world, for many, sleep has once again become a struggle, not against the cold or the darkness, but against the anxieties, the distractions, and the relentless pace of modern life. Perhaps, by spending this time in their quiet, smoky, and intensely alive world, we can learn something of value. Perhaps we can learn to appreciate the profound luxury of a truly quiet room, the simple comfort of a warm bed, the deep peace that comes from feeling safe and secure. Perhaps, by understanding the challenges they faced just to get through the night, we can find a new sense of perspective on our own challenges, and a deeper gratitude for the comforts we so often take for granted. The history of sleep is a quiet and often overlooked part of the human story, but it is a story that speaks to our most basic needs and our most enduring struggles. Thank you for joining us on this long journey into the past. We have traveled from the setting of the winter sun to the first signs of the spring thaw, all from the confines of a single, humble room. We hope that this immersion in a slower, quieter, and more elemental world has brought you a sense of calm, a feeling of connection to the deep currents of history, and, above all, a deep and profoundly restful sleep. If you have found this journey to be a peaceful and enriching experience, we warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel for more quiet histories, more stories designed to soothe the mind and comfort the spirit in the quiet hours of the night. For now, may your own world be peaceful, may your own bed be warm, and may you sleep well.